what I'll be presenting on today is work that I came into that was already ongoing. Linda Nicolai, who was one of my mentors during my postdoc, along with Robert Heimer, both of them are co-investigators, co-PIs, on a study of injection drug users, gay men, and their sexual partners in St. Petersburg, Russia. And I have to say Russia because people always think I mean Florida otherwise. So I did not design the study. I can't take credit for its creativity, for its insight. I'm analyzing the data, so I'm here to present really mostly their work. So the first thing you see about this slide probably is that it's about Russia, and we don't hear a lot about HIV in Russia. So what the heck were we doing there? St. Petersburg is a lovely place. I'll give you the little Lonely Planet version of it in just a couple seconds. It was built, it was commissioned pretty much in the early 18th century by Peter the Great. It's called the Venice of the Baltic because it's built on 42 little islands and islets separated by canals. And you can take cool like vaporetti through it, and it's incredibly beautiful, and it's like done in this totally Baroque style, and it's a trippy place. It's where the Hermitage is. So why are we in Russia? Why'd we go all the way there to study HIV? We have plenty of HIV in North America. There's a lot of HIV in the developing world that we know of, but this might seem like kind of an esoteric place to be doing it. But, you know, and I'm an epidemiologist. I want to go where the disease is. That's why I work with sexually transmitted infections among homosexually active men, because we're #1 with a bullet with HIV in this country. We're the ones who get HIV more than anyone else. That's true in a lot of countries. So what's the interest in Russia? Epidemiologists, you know, you're all in the public health program, so you know what this is. You know, the water pump outside the John Snow pub in London. It's like, we got water pumps here. You know, what are we going all the way to Russia to find a problematic water pump for? Well, I'll give you a little background on Russia, and it'll lead up to why we're doing an HIV study there. Russia has been, can you hear me okay? Okay, Russia's been through a lot in the 20th century, unless you just beamed down from Mars, you know that. Started in the early 20th century as a czarist state, which had only recently gotten rid of serfdom. It was feudalism. Most of the citizens were not citizens. They were actually slaves of their vassals. And then went through a revolution, World War I, a revolution, World War II, which killed 30 million Russians. This is a memorial, a carved relief by one of the two places in the Neva River, which when frozen during the 2 winters that it was blockaded by the Nazi army, that it was, you know, one of 2 places in the city where you could get water with your bucket and then run home hoping that a sniper didn't pick you off while you got home. So these are kind of tough people. They've been through a lot. What brought us to HIV is things that have happened in the more recent past. In 1989 through 91, really, was the period of transition from Marxism to a capitalist economy, and a huge number of a great deal of turmoil happened with that. It's as, you know, for the Americans in the audience, we're used to a very stable form of government here. Imagine that changed within a short period of time. That was a difficult transition period, but what was even a bigger deal was the economic collapse that came in 1994. As my colleagues in St. Petersburg, as Olga Levina said to me, we thought it was hard to get bread and milk in the grocery stores under communism, but then after the economic collapse, it was just ridiculous. Elderly people just stopped receiving pension checks. Paychecks were no longer being cut, even though people were showing up to the factory for work every day and every week. The system, the infrastructure of the country basically fell apart. It's one of the bizarre cases that we know of where life expectancy for a country actually went down during the early 1990s. That's pretty much unprecedented. Except in some places in sub-Saharan Africa due to HIV. this was primarily due to other factors. Striking rise in Russian mortality is beyond the peacetime experience in industrialized countries, with a 5-year decline in life expectancy in over 4 years' time. Many factors operate simultaneously, including economic and social instability, high rates of tobacco and alcohol consumption, poor nutrition, depression, and deterioration of the healthcare system. That appeared in JAMA about 12 years ago. I would throw in there too that interpersonal violence and suicide also took a great number of lives, particularly those of men, during the post-Soviet period. So, okay, what's that got to do with HIV? Well, it's almost like in a war. More people die of infectious diseases following a war or during a war than usually die from bullets or shrapnel. With turmoil comes ill health effects, and this is kind of a case study in that. This appeared by, he's got an Armenian name, but he's a Russian writer in the Journal of STD and AIDS, and I think it sounds a little bit like a moral panic, what he's getting to here, but it also frames the issue, I think. Fundamental cultural and social and economic transitions happened during this period. Sustained economic crises worsened the quality of life. We had poverty, joblessness, refugee migration, and fatalism concerning the future. And we had social acceptance of prostitution, which has its pros and cons. Temporary sexual relationships among young people in declining age at first sex, and whether or not you think these are, you know, morally or ethically shiny and good for you, they can have deleterious health effects. So the big thing that happened that concerns HIV during this period of turmoil was, remember, you had a lot of out-of-work people. You had a lot of people who were not receiving government stipends that they were used to, including a huge number of veterans of the Afghan war, many of whom were disabled and didn't really have a way of surviving, who took advantage of existing drug trade routes coming in from not the Golden Triangle of Southeast Asia, but the Golden Triangle of Southwest Asia. Following the Afghan war and following the turmoil that happened with the Soviet excursion into Afghanistan in 1980 and its aftermath, you had a lot of poppies grown there, kind of like we saw with the Taliban not so long ago. And black tar, which is heroin, which is similar to the stuff that comes from Mexico. It's very minimally processed, called chorny, which means black. It's essentially opium, it's gunk. Was getting dragged into Russian cities very, very cheaply. And what happened is a huge proportion of a birth cohort became addicted to heroin. We know that in the United States, the #1 birth cohort year for picking up heroin was 1955. And although it hasn't been formally quantified, all the anecdotal evidence suggests that the years that people most picked up heroin, the birth years, were 1978 to 1982. So you've got this bolus of folks who picked up heroin moving through the demographic python as time goes by, and they've acquire and transmit HIV. Let's say, just go to the next slide. So before we did this study, what led us to do a study of HIV among injection drug users in St. Petersburg? Well, we had some evidence that there was a problem. There were, studies of varying validity and generalizability that were showing 2 to 4% of the IDUs in the city were infected in '98, then 11 to 18% by 2000, 30% by 2002. Looks like we've got an emerging infection problem here. What we now know, independent of this study, of the study I'll be presenting here, but that contributes to it, Russia now has one of the fastest growing epidemics in the world. About 1% of the Russian population is HIV infected. That translates to 500,000 to 1.5 million Russians, given the appropriate confidence intervals around everything. But unlike many other countries, unlike other industrialized countries, the vast majority of the infections are among injection drug users. We also saw some other indicators that injection drug users were not the only population being affected. Positive test prevalence, which HIV testing is done for almost all women who present at a hospital to give birth. If they're getting prenatal care, it's done then. If they haven't had prenatal care, they do a rapid test and stat they get are the heart that will prevent neonatal transmission. The positive test prevalence went from nothing in 1998 in the city to almost 1.5% by 2002. Not huge numbers. Well, actually, that's a pretty high positive test prevalence for pregnant women in the developed world. The good thing is nearly all of these women do get heart, but nevirapine rather, but the rapid rise was what concerned us. Another population that they did, 37% of St. Petersburg street youth were found to be HIV infected. The problem was, it's clear that that it's going to be higher among those who inject, but then it was also higher among those using inhalants, and you don't get HIV from inhalants. It was independently associated with being an orphan, and being a double orphan more than a single orphan. And those aren't things that transmit HIV. So clearly social disruption was playing a part in this. And then what led directly to this study was they noticed that between 2001 and 2003, the proportion of newly diagnosed cases, newly reported cases, went from 5 to 20%, which was a possible indicator that HIV was no longer just being transmitted within the core group of injection drug users, but then spreading onto their sex partners, spilling over to the other people at risk. And the question was, will enough of this happen to sustain a generalized heterosexual epidemic like is seen in other areas of the world? So this is the group that got together to talk about those questions. There were 4 sites in the US, including us partnering with the Biomedical Center in St. Petersburg, the Sexual Acquisition and Transmission of HIV Cooperative Agreement Program, to look at the role of sexual transmission within cores, meaning gay men and drug users. They included non-injection drug users because of so much sexual transmission going on between crack cocaine users, and to look at what the overall epidemic effect would be to people outside those groups. Oh, sorry, didn't switch this slide around. This is part of the background of why we did this study, because the study included gay men. I gave you background on IDUs, on other populations in St. Petersburg. Now, a little late, I'll give you the information that we had about gay men in Russia prior to doing this study, which was basically jack. Pretty much everything. I mean, you go to the latest information on the Eurosurveillance website, eurosurveillance.euro or something. The latest thing they've got for Russia is one small study, 400 guys, a total convenience sample of guys showing up at gay bars. They didn't even weight weight them by how often they went to bars. So it's really just a study of how many people were standing around a bar at any given moment. Not the most methodologically strong survey, but it found 1.5% had reported an HIV positive test. This was pretty much all we knew about gay men and HIV in Russia to that point. But 37% had not used a condom for their last act of anal sex. Huge proportion of sex trade. About 1 in 5 had either paid for sex or been paid for sex. 37% also had female partners. So there's a lot of potential, not a lot of HIV, but a lot of potential for transmission within the population and then outside the population. So that made us want to study gay men in Russia too. The methods that SATCAP used, it was pretty much a cross-sectional study. Between 2005 and 2008, they sampled from the 2 core groups and also their male and female sexual partners. So we had 2 core respondent-driven sampling. Respondent-driven sampling begins with seed participants. Like, let's say you're going to be in a study of public health students, and you get into the study the traditional way, like by maybe answering an ad. What happens then is you're asked to recruit other members of your population because you know those people. And because you got paid $20 to be in the study, they'll pay the other person you recruit $20, but then they'll give you $5 because you successfully recruited somebody else. It's not so much to twist your arm to twist other people's arms, but it's enough to say thanks and make you not feel taken advantage of if you actually do it. It differs from a snowball sample in that at each step, with each recruitment, you weight by the inclusion probabilities. So you say if 8 of the 10 other public health students that you know are female, but the one person you recruited was male, that's kind of not random recruitment. So that you can do through the magic of mathematical weighting, allegedly, with long enough recruitment chains, you can get your sample to emulate a probability sample. But yeah, right. It doesn't really happen in real life. It's a lot better in theory. It turns out that RDS seems to be a better recruitment tool than a sampling tool. It's somewhere between just a crude snowball sample and an actual probability sample. And that's why we're hosting a small symposium in the spring called RDS 2.0 to see what we can do with the technique. Blood specimens to test for HIV were tested by, we ran ELISAs and Western blots to confirm the positives. I don't have on this slide, we also tested for syphilis, we did syphilis serologies, tested for gonorrhea, chlamydia, and Hep C and B. We used anonymous structured questionnaires using CASI, which is basically that you take a questionnaire on a laptop instead of paper and pencil. And we asked for information on sexual risk behaviors and then information about up to 5 most recent sexual partners. And got the information about social networks that I described earlier that you needed to do the weighting. And here's what we got. We got 669 IDUs, 231 homosexually active men, and those don't overlap because the guys who did overlap those two groups were 22, all of 22. So we don't have a lot of power to look at homosexually active men here, but we have more, and we have probably a better sample of data than in previous studies. The prevalence of HIV antibody among the injection drug users is huge. It's 44%. That's a lot. That was higher than, even as a follow-up to 30, that's a huge number of people. Among homosexually active men who didn't inject drugs, it was 7%, which is definitely present. It's about half what you would see in a city its size in the United States, or about 3/4 what you would see in Europe. The interesting thing is the gay men who injected drugs looked a lot more like the drug injectors who weren't gay men than the gay men who didn't inject. So their risk is, possibly coming from injection rather than from sex. We don't know yet. Hepatitis C, nearly universal, nearly ubiquitous among the people who injected, and a heavy burden of STIs among anybody. I mean, you screen any group of people and you get prevalence for bacterial sexually transmitted infections of 6, 8, and 14%. That's a lot of people with chlamydia or gonorrhea on board. The proportion of the people who were positive who were previously diagnosed is pretty low. In this country, what proportion of people with HIV don't know that they have HIV? Do you know?
20.
Yeah, it's about 20%. Yeah, here it's the proportion who were previously diagnosed was 42 with the injection drug users. So it was 58 didn't know that they had HIV. 69% of the MSM didn't know they had HIV. So much lower. coverage with testing, even though most of them had been tested in the past. It just wasn't enough. So we looked at characteristics associated with HIV infection and risky sex for both groups. I'll just present it for HIV infection for IDUs today. We controlled for a bunch of potential covariates. We didn't want to take it too far because I didn't want it to be a fishing expedition, because we didn't have that much N to work with, and I didn't want any spurious p-values. But these are the usual suspects. I'll just give you the adjusted odds ratios. This is the odds. These are the adjusted odds ratios for testing HIV positive if you were a non-gay injection drug user in Russia. The women were more likely to test positive. The people who had active employment less, people who had a history of incarceration more, and people who resided with their family were more likely to test positive. And that is an interesting thing on a few different levels, actually, because one, it's an indicator of socioeconomic status. Who lives with their family when they're an adult? Well, people who don't have the money to live on their own, because no one in their right mind would do that by choice. No. It also means that you don't get to shoot up at the kitchen table, do you? You know? You're not going to do it in front of mama and papa in, you know, your kvartira. It's just not going to work. It's associated in some studies with unhygienic injection practices, because you're doing it on the sly. You know. So we looked at the homosexually active men, where we included the IDUs in here because we needed to conserve N by any means possible. HIV infection was associated with being older than age 24 or older, having a history of drug injection, and negatively associated with full or part-time employment. Things changed a little because we had this funny situation where we had a fair number of men, we had about 15 guys who, everybody got a global question. Do you have sex with men, do you have sex with women, or do you have sex with both? And about 15 guys said, I only have sex with women. And we had others who told us they had sex with men and women, but so, you know, this number said only women. So then they went on to tell us about the 2 or 3 male sex partners that they'd had when we asked them who the last people you had sex with were. But for coding reasons, just for skip patterns in the computer program, they didn't get asked questions about, so the last time you were with this guy, you know, who you've given the initials TR or whatever, what did you do with him? Did you have sex with a condom? Did you have sex without a condom? You know, is it on the internet? You know, what did you do? A ton of invasive questions we would ask. And they didn't answer those things because they weren't given the question. So we weren't able to assess their condom use, which was highly annoying. So what I did is I limited this to, well, guess what? Okay, I limited this. This 253 is wrong. It's actually down by about 20, no, by about 15. But rather than being an injection drug user, the greatest risk, when I was able to assess what your partners were like was that last guy you had sex with a drug injector? Having a partner who injected drugs was the highest risk factor. So what does that tell you? Well, we go back to the earlier slide where we saw that the HIV prevalence was so much greater among drug injectors, including the gay men among them, than among gay men. This is a bizarre situation where we might actually see gay men getting HIV from the injection drug users. That's just a postulate at this point. I'm basing that on few observations, but we shall see. The prevalence of risky behavior among these guys was high. About 20% of them had ever participated in sex work, traded sex for money or drugs. About a third of them had had sex while high in the last 6 months with one partner or another. Almost half of them had had any unprotected sex, and then when I limited it, I excluded, well, it's one thing for you to have unprotected sex with somebody you've met that night, and it's another thing for you to have unprotected sex with your partner of 5 years and you've both been HIV tested and blah, blah, blah. I excluded those partnerships where they knew the partner of the status and it was a main partner. 42% of them had had unprotected sex that is really risky for HIV. And the proportion was greater with all of these, I think. Was greater for sex while high, but was actually lower for unprotected anal sex for the injection drug users. Yet they have more HIV. So where's the HIV coming from? And then I broke down the number of partners in the last 6 months with whom the last act of anal intercourse was unprotected. So it's not just this, this half of people have had unprotected sex that's the problem. We had 47% had no partners of this, 32% had one, but then 20% of the people, of the guys in the study had had unprotected anal sex with 2 guys or more in the last 6 months. So this is a hierarchy of risk here. We not just have half the guys engaging in a little bit of risk, we have 20% of them engaging in a lot of risk in a 6 months period. So the only independent association for unprotected sex with a male partner was HIV infection, negatively associated. The negative guys were much less likely to report risky sex. 5 of the HIV positive participants reported unprotected sex with a total of 6 partners, but none of them had been previously diagnosed. And none had been previously diagnosed. So we didn't have a single guy tell us who knew he had HIV, right? We tested him for HIV. We found out whether he had HIV. Have you ever had a positive test before? Oh yeah, 2 years ago. None of those guys had told us that they had unprotected sex with another guy. And we're thinking, wow, that's really low. But in Russia, the laws against knowingly exposing someone to your HIV are severe. So we're wondering whether that could be some reporting bias. However, we found when we looked at female partnerships that the greatest predictor of having unprotected sex with a female partner was having a history of drug injection. It's the IDUs who are crossing over to the females by and large. But 4% of them reported unprotected sex with female partners. Also, all 4 participants were IDUs. None of these were gay men. They'd been previously diagnosed, 3 had been previously diagnosed with HIV. So these guys knew they had HIV and were having unprotected sex with their female partners. The funky thing is, of the 4 women they exposed, all were IDUs, and 2 of those had already told the participant that they were HIV positive. So maybe these guys are making a decision about which women to expose because it's like, well, she already has HIV, so that's one thing. Or she's an IDU, maybe the decision is to knowingly expose an IDU partner more than a non-IDU partner. But that's speculation. That's the question that it raises. So what does this tell us about HIV among drug injectors in St. Petersburg? They got a lot of HIV, particularly compared to what they had had a few years earlier. Many times what the prevalence is in Western Europe. It's similar to what we saw in Harlem and the South Bronx at the height of the HIV epidemic here. Or at the height of the HIV epidemic, what we saw among gay men in San Francisco. These guys are getting clobbered. And there are other indicators of rapid transmission that are kind of independent from these data. For instance, they were all of the same genotype, but that's another talk. a nice thing is it allowed us to estimate the number of active drug injectors in St. Petersburg. There are about 80,000, give or take 3,000. Was a piece that Robert Heimer and I just put out. That's a lot. If half of those people have HIV and it's been going up the way it has, it makes you wonder at what point this will begin to saturate, because we really never saw HIV prevalence above 50% in the United States. So will it start to slow down? We don't know. What does it tell us about homosexually active men in the city? The first caveat is, the first thing I said when I showed you this slide is we have a small n on our sampling strategy. It's limited. The prevalence of HIV infection is about 3/4 what it is in Western Europe, which means, given the size of the study, it's not that different. The prevalence of risk behavior is about the same. About 37% of these guys were taking, 42% of these guys were taking serious risk. That's pretty close to what you would see in Spain or France. And with HIV seroincidence among gay men, it's about 2% in Western Europe, North America, New Zealand. It's a little less in Australia. We can wonder whether we're having a similar seroincidence there, the number of new infections per 100 years of uninfected person time. Here's the funky thing, though. In the West, current prevalence was preceded by a much greater prevalence. 10, 15 years ago, we had a very high HIV prevalence among gay men in the United States. It went down for a while because those guys died, because it was before the time of HAART. If HIV prevalence among gay men in Russia has been very low until recently, and we've got these high rates of unprotected sexual contact between them, it's emerging into a pretty, I don't want to say naive population, because that means you've never been exposed before, so I'm being a good epidemiologist. But what it means is there could be an awful lot of susceptible guys to infect. So the incidence could actually wind up being greater than what it is in Western Europe. So if the prevalence has until recently been low in Russia, what does this mean with this rate of contact and the current rate of prevalence, if that's a new rate of prevalence, if that's an emerging infection? We'll have to do more work to get to that. It also tells us that we have some questions about bisexuality, drug injection, and sex work. We didn't have a lot of information on the bisexual guys. The ones who didn't provide it said they were heterosexual. It's like the t-shirt that was running around in the 90s that guys wore that said, "I'm not gay, but my boyfriend is." That's weird. Like, who were these other partners? Well, we had a great problem getting data on sex work in this study. The sex work questions were a little dodgy. So what we're kind of wondering is whether these guys who said, "I have no female partners, meanwhile, I'll tell you I had sex with male partner A and male partner B, but I won't tell you what I did with them," we're wondering whether those were sex partners, or trade sex partners. And that this might indicate a lot of our homosexually active IDUs trading sex with men for money or drugs and not getting recorded as that. And they could be a source of infection for both male and female partners. So in order to address these situations, we need better data on gay men in Russia, and we're doing, it's a really changing topography. This slide I look at and I go, what's emerging in Russia is that they have the opportunities for gay nightlife every bit as lame as we have in the United States. This is Central Station. That's a gay bar in St. Petersburg. And I got to tell you, I was there in May, and the thing that people kept impressing on me is this bar couldn't have been here 3 years ago. This couldn't have existed. This is totally new. All these people you see out here dancing and having fun, this is a whole new thing. It really did feel exciting. It's a watershed there. The other thing that they've got now, you see in the lower left, is you can meet a partner online You know, it's easier to find sex online than it is dominoes. And they've got that in, they've got Russian language websites right now, and you can just dial it up. Have someone in your bed that afternoon. So what that raises the question of is, if seroprevalence got to 7% without gay bars and without gay internet hookup sites, and 37% of the guys having unprotected sex in the last 6 months, or 42 rather, what's it going to be with the advent of these new methods of meeting people? You know, we just changed the whole structure. There's another thing that we see, which is in the post-Soviet era, I talked about earlier, female sex work and trafficking in women increased along with transmission risk, but it looks like sex work among men might be increasing too. This picture in the lower left, I took from gaytravel.ru, which is a website where if you want to go on sex travel, like you can to Thailand, you can go to Russia. And you know, this charming guy on the left here, I'm sure is with the other one because of his great personality. You know, it's like, God, it's like the cheesiest picture I've ever seen. It's so scary. So if that's an emerging thing, that's gonna affect the transmission as well. So how are we gonna study this stuff? I'll raise those questions later. It raises issues of controlling transmission. I'll jump back to drug users. We've got challenges in both these areas in addressing transmission among drug users and gay men. Right now in Russia, if you're addicted to heroin, you've really got one mode of getting help, which is, you know, the narcologists, the addiction specialists there are going to lock you up and you're going to withdraw, which is a painful and dangerous way to get off heroin, which is what the injection drug users use there. There's no drug substitution therapy. It's illegal. You can't get methadone. Your doctor can't prescribe it for you. Pharmacies can sell you syringes. They don't have needle exchange, but syringes are legal. The only thing is, every store you go into, whether it's the electronics store I went in to get a new adapter, I wanted a second adapter for another plug, you know, that kind of thing, they all have off-duty cops moonlighting right by the door, because it's a chaotic environment and people will just walk out with stuff otherwise. So if you're a heroin addict, you really don't want to walk up to the counter at their version of Rite Aid and buy a pack of syringes. You could get beaten up when you leave. You know, you could get harassed later on. And we know from another study that fear of police arrest for carrying equipment, like from a pharmacy with clean syringes, is associated with risky injection in the Russian context. So this fear actually affects not just how we do HIV prevention work, but how we do HIV prevention research. Controlling transmission has some overall challenges to it. Our work is affected by factors in both of our countries, especially trying to do this cross-cultural work. Drug users are stigmatized. You see, this is like one of the few needle exchanges that happened in Russia. It was a pretty grim place. Gay men are stigmatized and not prioritized despite a huge epidemiological burden in both countries. It's very difficult for any work with gay men to have legitimacy. The alarming picture that I have here, this guy tried to organize a Russian gay pride parade in Moscow in 2009, and that's what the mayor had the cops do to him. It's so if you just want to waltz in as a researcher and say, oh, I want to do this important work with this population, in their country as in ours, it might not get met with the best reception. Another real challenge to doing this kind of work from the perspective of Yale or a US researcher, or even researchers from the UK or other areas, is there's still a great deal, our relationship with Russia is still burdened by decades of mistrust in the past. I don't know if you remember that song from the 80s, but if you think it sounds, what's the old joke? I'm here from the United States government and I'm here to help. It's like, that sounds bad enough if you're American, but can you imagine if you're Russian? Weren't you guys, didn't you used to have missiles pointed at us? It's a funky relationship. So those are all going to be difficulties that we're going to have to address. We know little about, we know more about injection drug use and HIV in Russia, a great deal more than we used to. Most of what we know is bad, and we need to understand where things are going to peak, whether HIV is going to spill over into other populations. And part of doing that work is stymied by difficult attitudes around drug use. The same thing is going to be is happening with doing work among gay men. That's just in its infancy, but both of these things have a great potential for future spread. So I want to thank the people that I work with here at Yale on the SATHCAP study, the good folks at the Biomedical Institute who we work with, people at Yale Cira. Thanks for the money, NIMH. We always appreciate it. And the good people at NGO Stellit. And if you can't see it, no, it doesn't really show up well. This is the John Snow Pub, which is a great place to go for a pint in the UK. And this is Robert Heimer, who's the PI of the study with our colleagues from Stellit at a swanky place in St. Petersburg. So I can take questions. Thanks.